Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 266.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I am back again. Well, I'm back again, but I'm back with again an episode of the Diary of a CEO podcast. It keeps coming up with new episodes that catch my eye, and this is another one that caught my eye. It's another one with an exceedingly dumb title. I had a rant last time, didn't I, about their titles. This one actually seems to stay the same on different platforms, which is one thing, I suppose. But this one is, let's, keep up with the dramatic undertone. The foot specialist. Your toes can predict if you'll die early. This will fix plantar fasciitis. Let's not get me started on that again. So the guest on this episode is Dr. Courtney Conley, and she's a physician who specialises in feet. She's the founder of Gait Happens and Total Health Solutions, and she aims to educate people about the importance of the human foot to overall health. And she's another very interesting guest, very interesting woman, very empathetic. I was saying, I seem to have, or at least I've watched a run of brilliant female guests who I've really, really enjoyed listening to. This one was interesting, I thought, from a running perspective, and some choices that I've made, especially with footwear, which we shall go into later, one of those controversial topics in the running community. So Stephen kicks off by asking, what and at what stage are we getting it wrong when it comes to footwear? And she says, this is a direct quote from her, if we started with our children and put them in the right footwear, I'd be out of a job, because that's where it starts. That's when the foot starts developing, and that's when we start to build strength and structure in the foot. But from a young age, we start interfering with what goes on in the foot. She goes on to talk about the feet and how they're built, basically. She says that the foot is designed to move. Shocker. But the arch, for example, the arch recoils, so it should lengthen and then contract. And it should be free to be able to fully move within that. There are 4 layers of muscle in your foot. So we have to respect the function of the foot, and footwear can very easily deter that function. So she says she is obsessed with feet. She's always looking at people's feet because they are so important to our health in so many ways. And she does go on to talk about that. Stephen asked her if the biggest risk as we get older is falling. And so, stability is key. And we've heard, haven't we, in a lot of podcasts when we're talking about things like balance and movement, that one of the reasons for maintaining those is that the risks of dying basically after having a fall get higher and higher as we get older. And not necessarily immediately, but probably all know or heard of someone who's gone into hospital and either hasn't come out or has had long-term problems because of that. So Dr. Conley says that, yes, that is one of the sequelae, good word, I thought, of what's going to happen if we don't pay attention. But when you look at the function as a whole, things like walking, 1 in 3 people over 45 will experience foot pain. And I remember this as one of the biggest things that I noticed when I first started losing weight from being around 300 pounds. As I started to lose weight, one of the things that made a huge difference to me was getting up in the morning and not sort of wincing on my feet. I had pain in my foot. Apparently that was all to do with compressing the fat pads. But for whatever reason, if you have pain in your foot, it really does impact, and you really notice when it's not there anymore. So other than low back pain, she said, there's really nothing else that matches these numbers, these statistics. The big issue with foot pain, she says, is that you can't do much when you have it. It restricts your freedom of movement, and this then has a knock-on effect on your physical health and also your mental health. And she says that she's so passionate about it because it's not just about pain. It's what happens when you can't walk and use your feet and the bigger things that leads to. Stephen asked if there's a connection from the feet up in terms of sort of knock-on issues. And she says, yes, absolutely. Especially if both feet are affected. She says there will be a way to trace back to what the issue is that's leading to that problem in the feet, bunions, for example. But other common problems like plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, other tendon issues. So we asked her a bit more about who she is. She trained as a chiropractor, and I know chiropractors can get a bad rap, can't they? And sometimes justifiably. But from some of the people that I listened to who trained and maybe still or don't still practice as a chiropractor is that they take and one of the reasons they chose that, and I think naturopaths, similar functional medicine, is treating people as a whole, treating people holistically. And she says that she knew that she wanted to get into a type of medicine that was proactive rather than reactive. And that's something I think that you hear a lot, isn't it, with that kind of training. And movement has always been a big part of her life. So she wanted to do something in that area. She knew that's the broad speaking area that she wanted to work within. When she was younger, she was a ballet dancer, and then she shifted into running and triathlons. So movement has always been a big part of her life and a lifeline for her. And with hindsight, a real survival mechanism, actually. She really needed it for her mental health and things. And she had all the foot issues. I mean, you can imagine, especially, ballet dancers, they're really at the extreme of foot abuse, bunions, heel pain, you name it, she had it. And she saw what addressing these problems did for her with all the things, mental health, physical health, and she wanted to do that for other people. And so the importance of walking, this is something that we've talked about a lot, but she's got some good stats that actually made me pay a lot more attention to my step count. I don't know if you remember, a long time ago, we talked about that 10,000 steps a day that actually originated from a Japanese, what was it? Well, he was producing the gadget, the pedometer, I think, and came up with this almost sort of arbitrary number. That's sort of where it started. But I think there's been a lot more. Well, I know there's been a lot more research into that, so there's more behind it now. But she says she thinks of it as the most underrated, underutilized, easily accessible activity that most of us are not doing or not doing enough of. The research on average step count that most people are doing globally is 4,500 to 4,900 steps a day. And that means that there are a lot of people doing less than that, of course, because that's just the average. Because when she works with people, she looks at baseline numbers. What's your baseline is a more important question than comparing yourself to other people, but then increasing that baseline. So she gives an example that if your baseline is 2,500 steps, if you increase that by 500 steps a day, and I don't know where they're getting their stats from, so, slight caveat there, increase your steps by 500 a day, that can reduce your risk of cardiovascular mortality by 7%. If you have 1,000 step increase, you can reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by 15%.
Wow.
So, if you're not getting many step counts, this is something we've touched on. I remember talking about this and it being a motivational thing with strength training. Actually, if you're starting from not being able to do much, you can see a huge improvement with just a bit of an increase. And so that seems to apply with walking too. So, you don't have to worry about not hitting the 10,000 or whatever. You just have to think about what is your baseline and increasing that. And she gives an example talking about a patient of hers, 27-year-old man. The last doctor he'd seen had told him to limit his step count to 2,500 a day to rest his foot. He had pain in his foot, but it was chronic pain, not acute pain. So she was saying, you don't need to, yes, you would need to rest your foot if it was acute pain, but chronic pain, that is not the answer. So 2 years later of practicing this, he'd come to see her, and he was pretty desperate. He was one of quads, so he had 3 siblings, and he got to watch them going out and about and enjoying their lives. So he was in a pretty bad way, physically and mentally. He was living in his father's basement, and he was afraid to go above this 2,500 steps a day. And he tried all the exercises, the physio, etc., etc. So he was suffering from depression and just living a very limited and painful life. So her goal was to get him outside walking and loading his foot. Forget the heel pain, she says. That's not my focus. It's all about getting you outside and walking again. And apparently, as an aside, we can handle 4 to 6 times our body weight when we're walking, but it has to be loaded appropriately or our muscles atrophy. So they had to take it easy and starting to introduce steps. And this links in very well to the stats she previously mentioned. So she introduced to him the concept of a micro walk. A micro walk is 5 minutes, and the average 5-minute walk is 500 steps. Handy. The average 10-minute walk is 1,000 steps. So you can see how easily you can incorporate those and tap into those reduced health problems. So he started adding micro walks. And he had good days and he had bad days, but she wanted to start building his confidence and his movement again. Another aside here with talking about depression, 5,000 steps a day can reduce the risk of having symptoms of depression. 7,500 steps can reduce the prevalence of the diagnosis. Back to this guy, she also changed his footwear. She didn't really talk about what, but considering some things she said later, we will be able to imagine. And then at the end of each week, and I like this, and this really illustrates well, I think, the kind of approach she has of treating the person as a whole. At the end of each week, they would talk about 3 good things that had happened that week. So she would ask him to tell her 3 good things that had happened that week. He struggled to start with, but it got easier. I'm not sure how long she'd been treating him, a while I think, but she said that she'd spoken to him about a month before recording, and he was now walking on average 5,000 to 6,000 steps a day. He had good days and bad days, but more good than bad. More importantly, he was now getting out and about, spending time with people, going to church again, getting out of that basement and improving his mental health. So she says it's the person behind the step count. That's her why. Yes, of course, it has the capacity to improve your physical health, but more it's about how you interact with the world. And then she goes on to talk about footwear, and he has a few examples. If you're watching this on YouTube, he has a few examples out on the table, but it comes down to a few basic things. The first thing is that most footwear is too narrow. And so most footwear is restricting our feet, especially our toes. This is most apparent with women. And she cites a statistic. Girls especially are wearing too narrow shoes. Apparently 70% on average of them are wearing shoes that are too narrow. She says just think about the shape of your foot and then put your average shoe next to it. And you'll see the shoe is not the same shape as the foot. Your foot flares out at the toes. It's wider at the toes than it is at the rest, but most shoes are narrower at the toes. And this is where, if you've done any research into barefoot shoes or any of that malarkey, you'll hear people talking about toe box all the time. And she talks about it. And that's what that is. And you need a wide toe box. So ideally, you want a shoe that isn't restricting, pushing your toes in together. And this is really important because of your foot and toe mobility. Again, this taps into balance, movement, all these things. The next thing is the heel to toe drop. So obviously we're talking about heels. What's that slope? Your foot is supposed to sit flat. How does it sit when you've got nothing on your feet. The tissues in the back of your leg are in a good length tension relationship. You have even pressure on your foot. When you change that, you put additional pressure in the front of your foot and you shorten the muscles in the back of your leg and start changing the function of the foot, but you also start changing the function of everything above it. So your calves, hamstring, back. So a lot of back injuries can actually be traced back to the feet and vice versa. Things like the strength of your hip controls the foot as well. And then cushioning. And she says there's always a trade-off here. Yes, having lots of cushioning in your footwear feels fantastic. But when you interfere with how the foot feels, there's a loss of sensory perception. The foot is a sensory organ, thousands of receptors in your feet that are constantly getting information to keep you upright, basically. And so the more you cushion that and dumb those receptors down, the more difficult it becomes for your feet to fulfill their true purpose. However, she says, and this is where the trade-off comes in, if you're stood on a hard surface all day, it's more likely that you're going to need a little bit of cushioning to keep you comfortable. And she says that this is a perfectly reasonable trade-off. You know, she's not, she's not being completely dictatorial about this. But she says it is then really important to keep the foot in its functional position, i.e. as flat as possible with a wide toe box. They talk about plantar fasciitis, very common problem, and insoles, which is probably the most common treatment given. And she says that, yes, this does provide immediate relief, but we get back into that use it or lose it issue. So she says, yes, wear the insert and strengthen your foot in recovery, but she says it's very important to have an exit strategy for that insert and get your foot back on the ground. I'm not sure if that was the reason. My mum got some insoles decades ago, but she's still wearing them. So a lot of people, they get them and they've got them for life. That, that's very common. And they're advised to do that. But it's not the best thing, according to her, of course. But like with a lot of these things, the logic works for me. So for me, it works. So your footwear is very important. And this is one of the times I laugh to myself because I feel justified in living half my life in Crocs, even though my sister has frequently threatened to disown me if I wear them out in public, although she's eased up a little bit on that. And it wasn't in this video, but in another one, I was watching a guy talking about Crocs. He was actually talking about someone running marathons in Crocs, but he was talking about them in that they have a very wide toe box, massive tick there. They're a wide enough toe box. They're an exaggerated wide toe box. He said they're wide enough that you can actually put toe spacers on and still put your Crocs on. They're very commonly worn by people like nurses. Very good reason. So actually they're a very good shoe for something like that. It is important to not necessarily get the actual Crocs, but make sure you can flex them. And this other video I was watching, he was talking about, he's saying they were Crocs. He said they're very flexible, but there was a cheap brand that he had and there was no flex in them. So the flex is important. The other thing that's good about Crocs is anyone who's worn them, they have those little bubbles inside. And well, actually there are three things. There are the bubbles that help with that whole sensory thing, although your foot's not on the ground, although a pair I've got are so worn through, it almost feels like they are. But you have that, there's that sort of bobbly stuff, which is mimicking a little bit. It's sort of stimulating that sensory input on the soles of your feet. The other thing is that there's not much. There is a bit of a heel to toe drop, but not much. It's something like 6 mil. So they're almost flat. Barefoot trainers, they talk about. And this was a decision that I made when I started running again, when I started the Couch to 5K. I was quite interested in the whole barefoot trainer thing. And I did a bit of research and I had an old pair of trainers that I knew I had to replace because they'd been chewed by the dog and apart from anything else. But they didn't do everything wrong. They were cheap trainers actually, so they didn't have a lot of cushioning. They were reasonably flat, but they were certainly quite narrow. And so I started looking into the barefoot trainer thing. Now, I have to say, I would never be seen dead in those ones that have the individual toes. Never fear, I'm never going to wear those. I think well, I'm just going to put it out there. I think they're hideous, but I would never wear those. And I couldn't afford that. Everyone can probably think, well, not everybody who's looked into barefoot training, you can probably think of a brand, and they had that on there. And I think Stephen is sponsored by them. Really expensive. So I got on Amazon and I found some nice cheap ones that I actually quite liked. Very simple, very plain. When I first got them, I thought they look a little bit clown shoey, because they're wide at the front. So they have this wide toe box. She talked a little bit about when they have a mesh top. And actually, I do feel you can actually feel the air getting in a little bit. So anything that you can do basically to mimic walking barefoot is good when it comes to trainers. And I watched loads and loads of videos, as is my tendency, about the difference. And they talked a lot about runners who were used to, your more typical trainer who wanted to switch. And they talked about the importance of transitioning. I wasn't transitioning. I was starting out. So I felt confident to just sort of go straight in there and do it from the get-go. And I really like them. And I do feel that it helps with the running. It helps to really feel what you're doing. It feels like, you get a better grip of the surface. You certainly can be much more mindful about the surfaces you're running on and just how your foot's moving. And like I say, I just like the logic of everything they're saying. But they did have an interesting conversation about some of these real highfalutin performance trainers. And I think he had a pair there. They go up quite steeply at the front, and that's got something to do with, when you're pushing off, they're very springy. They got carbon, this, that, and the other in. And she was saying, earn the right to use them, and had a really interesting conversation, I thought, with him about, he says he wears them all the time and they feel fantastic and he feels like he can, run on air and is that much faster. And she says, yeah, absolutely. But she said, here's my tip for you. She said, do all your work, do all your training in your barefoot shoes. Save those shoes, obviously not sort of brand new on your foot, so you've got to wear them in. Save those shoes for race day. And that will give you an advantage. You'll build all the strength and the function you need with predominantly using barefoot, but then you'll give yourself that lift and advantage on race day, which I thought was a great idea. Along that same line, they talked a little bit about hiking shoes and how a lot of people, when you think about hiking shoes, hiking boots, it's so important to give some support to your ankle. And she winced, said, well, actually, no, it comes back to what we've been talking about. Use it or lose it. You need all these things. Just be wary of giving yourself support unless there's a specific reason. Be wary about it, because if you're supporting those by keeping them rigid, those muscles aren't doing the things they need to do. And so you become reliant on having to support your ankle. You need that flex. You need to feel the ankle moving, because it sends the signals to your brain to adjust your balance, to adjust where you're putting your feet. All these things. The more you dampen that down by dampening those messages that your brain's getting, the more likely you are going to be to fall, slip, whatever. So just one more thing, one more stat, which I know you're going to love. It's about dementia, the association with movement, walking, and dementia and Alzheimer's risk. This is a bigger number, but 9,800 steps, let's just call it 10,000, steps a day can reduce the risks of dementia. But 3,800 steps, let's call it 4,000, will get you 50% of the maximal benefit. So 4,000 steps actually isn't that much, and it will get you a massive chunk of benefit for dementia that I think scares a lot of us as we're getting older. She talked about some really cool research looking at this elderly population and the relationship with walking. And another thing that she cited was that social connection is often a big part of it. And that adds hugely to the benefit. It's a perfect movement activity to do with other people. And so you can provide that much needed connection at the same time, which again is going to play into reducing these risks. There was loads of practical stuff that they talked about. She got down on the floor and played with Stephen's feet and explained a lot of things. So that's not interesting to talk about, but it was interesting to watch. And I think I've mentioned this watch that my friend Kelly sent me. And one of the things it measures is my steps. And so that's really something that I hadn't thought about too much other than in a general way. But now I kind of get excited to hit over a certain amount and actually realize how easy it is to do just by moving around. Like, I was astounded at this ultra event I went to. I supported my brother doing one of these crazy backyard ultras where you run on the hour, every hour for as many times as you can. He did 18, very proud of him, especially on the hottest day of the year. But we were joking because he had logged since midnight. He started running at 6 p.m. the previous night, but since midnight, he'd racked up 84,000 steps or something, which made me look at mine. And I was actually surprised to see that I'd racked up 8,500 steps from what I had considered. I hadn't been out for a walk other than pottering around, taking the dog for a pee and just going backwards and forwards, making him cups of tea and doing things for him. But I hadn't thought that I was moving around that much. But actually that's a good step day for me. Even with a walk and going for a run, I don't usually go much above maybe 12, 13, 14. So I think at the end of the day, I'd racked up something like 10,000 and I hadn't even taken the dogs for a walk, so that proved to me and it proves to me at home, just by getting up and going up and down the stairs, making a cup of tea, you could be adding in these micro walks. They talked a little bit about bungalow legs, which I always think of my mum. And although I lived in a house in France, it was mostly on one level. They were talking about how it's important to go up and down steps as well. But, it's actually quite easy to rack up those steps just by doing little movements throughout the day. So anyway, I've been rambling on, but I did find it really interesting, but I thought it was an easily incorporated into everyday life kind of thing, and perhaps make you think a little bit more about how often you move, but also the kind of things you put on your feet. And ideally maybe, walk around a bit more barefoot, because you can't get more barefoot than barefoot.
I love it. It's exciting that you it's almost like we've talked about running, and now to kind of go back and talk about the walking. I think so many times people see limitations with movement for various reasons: time, energy, health, environmental things. And I think getting back into just the idea of moving around gets you those steps. My office in my house is the furthest away from the kitchen. So if I walk out there to get 4 cups of coffee, I'm at least getting some steps. And, rather than sitting here sedentary all day, getting up and just even walking through the house, I don't even have to go outside. The other thing I was thinking as you were talking is, and I've done this before and I've experienced other people doing it. I don't know what this will mean in the future, because I'm thinking malls will be something of the past, shopping malls. But, people walking in malls. So if it's raining out, there is still an indoor place where you can walk and get a lot of steps in. I did that for a while when I was in graduate school. I would walk at the mall near me on days that weather-wise weren't good to be outside. The other thing that I loved is I felt so vindicated for all the ugly shoes that I have. I know that other people are like, oh, those are so not fashionable. But I looked into these things in the past, and I had some experience of developing a bunion. And so when I started researching it more, and I watched a couple of podiatrists really talk about the low heel drop, the wide toe box, is that, if you look again at the bone structure of your feet, it's narrow toward the ankle and then it splays out toward your feet. And when we scrunch in our toes, we actually affect all of those bones in the long part of the feet. And, bunions are a movement of those bones. So I suddenly felt very vindicated in getting all the wide toe shoes I could. I had always loved like those, I can't even think what they're called. And now I don't do running, but I do have some sneakers for some more active times. And I wear a particular brand that has a very wide toe box. They're very unattractive. I have lived in Birkenstocks for many years, just again, wide. My toes have plenty of space. I did get a pair of the shoes with the toes, and I never quite felt comfortable enough in those. But I now have a renewed vigor for embracing all of those wide-toed shoes that I bought. I also have just generally kind of wide feet. And so I've always been more comfortable in them. And for me, comfort is key.
Same.
If I'm going to wear something, it's going to be comfortable, clothing or shoes. I don't care how cute it is or how attractive it is. If I'm not comfortable, I'm not going to wear it. And so I love getting this validation that I'm also helping myself. But once again, Daisy, you have kind of inspired me. Like, okay, I've got to work on, one of the easy ways for me to get some steps in is take the dogs for a walk. They are always willing participants. And, just this, again, positive reinforcement that can be so significantly helpful to me. Not so much right now. It has lots of benefits now, but in the long term, as I look at, based on my health history, my parents, and, I should get out there and get some more steps. So I appreciate this episode.
Yeah, and I think if you like collecting a bit of data, but I think it can be quite a motivational thing to have some kind of something that measures how many steps you're doing. One, like I said, because you can sometimes be surprised at how easy it is to accumulate those steps without sometimes needing to go out for a specific walk. I mean, I should imagine most nurses, for example, rack up a huge amount of steps every day. But there are probably all sorts of, I've had waitressing jobs in the past. I should imagine my steps stacked up pretty quickly doing that, just walking around. But it's also motivating if your steps are coming in quite low, because you don't, like you were saying with walking the dogs, I'm always going to get a minimum number of steps in a day just purely on that basis. Obviously it varies depending how long our walk is, but I'm going to have a baseline. And so, if you don't have something like that, it can be a good way to see how easy, as she said, some of these micro walks, a 5-minute walk should rack you up an extra 500. And with that, comes that potentially 7% risk of cardiovascular disease. So there's every 5-minute walk brings gains.
That's the part that I really liked about this, Daisy, is, sometimes when I think like, oh, I have to do 10,000 or more. Oh, that sounds so, I can't imagine fitting that in. And I know I could, but it's just like, it's easier.
Sounds like a lot.
Yeah, to think of not doing it. But 5 minutes and the amount of health gain that provides, totally worth it. And then, as we've talked about with other things, once you do 5, pretty soon you're doing 7 or 8, and then you're up to 12. It just starts to grow. So I loved that she really highlighted the small incremental increases in walking have larger impact than what you would imagine for the increment of increase.
And actually, we're talking, it's this whole, thinking of long-term gain, but there are lots of short-term immediate gains that you can get that we've mentioned in the past. People like Dr. von der Wright, I seem to remember talking about this and, the benefits. And we've talked often about the benefits of walking, but something very quick and direct. I've cited that television program where they studies it with type 2 diabetics. I'm sure, a lot of the people that you work with at the fasting method will know this, that by go and get yourself a micro walk after eating and see the impact that has on problematic glucose numbers. That's going to be pretty immediate. You're going to see that benefit straight away. And then you can add the long-term things as well, let alone the other benefits from just getting outside, getting some fresh air, getting light, into your eyeballs. You know, there are so many actually immediate things, short-term benefits, medium-term, long-term, you know, and unless there's a problem with if you physically can't walk, it's accessible to everybody. And what she was saying about that guy at the beginning, you know, just think about, if you're thinking, oh yeah, but I can't be bothered. Think about if someone said, right, we're going to take that away from you. I'm not going to let you walk. How quickly are you going to want to go out and get yourself a micro walk? I know I'd want to be straight out there if you threatened to take it away from me.
The other piece is, you know, not equipment required. You know, there's not a big investment for walking. So any time that people are like, well, you know, there's this expense or this expense, the gear, the clothing, you don't have to buy special clothing to go walk. No. You don't have to buy special shoes to walk around your house barefoot. You know, there's really no financial investment required, which is nice. Probably for some of us, that's a detriment to walking because we want to go buy the equipment and I'm going to take on that so I can go shopping. But just really...
Feel free. Just walk to the shops.
That's right. I think for many of us, just to really, again, reiterate that this is something we can do during the day. It doesn't have to be a separate occasion in our day, that it's really something we can integrate into our day, just increasing 500 steps.
Yeah. So there you go. I thought you'd find that interesting, and I thought it would align with quite a few things that you do already.
Absolutely.
So until I see you next time, I hope you have a very walking-filled week. And wonderful at that, and everyone at home too.
Take good care, everyone.